The slap echoed through the entire emergency department before anyone understood what had happened. 1 second, Claire Rowan was pressing a blood-soaked gauze pad against a teenager's torn femoral artery, keeping him alive through sheer pressure and will. The next, Lieutenant Darren Voss's open palm connected with her cheek, hard enough to knock her sideways into a supply cart. Metal clattered, syringes scattered across linoleum. The boy on the gurney whimpered, and every nurse, every orderly, every doctor in Redstone Regional Medical Center's ER went completely silent, because nobody hit a nurse in front of witnesses and expected it to end quietly. Nobody, that is, except a man who had never once been told no. If this story already has you gripping your seat, you're exactly where I want you. Follow my channel so you don't miss a single moment of what happens next. Hit like and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning, because what Lieutenant Voss did in that ER was only the first mistake of many he would live to regret. Claire had worked the overnight shift 3 times that week already, and it showed in the small ways, the slight drag in her step when she moved between bays, the way she pressed her thumb into her own palm when she thought no one was looking, that old pressure point habit she'd picked up somewhere she didn't talk about anymore. Her scrubs were a faded teal, one size too large because the hospital laundry kept shrinking the mediums, and her dark hair was pulled back with the kind of rubber band that leaves a dent. She looked, to anyone who didn't know better, like exactly what the badge around her neck said she was. Claire Rowan, RN, Emergency Department, Redstone Regional Medical Center, Ashridge, Colorado. What the badge did not say was everything else. It was 11:47 p.m. when the call came in from the ambulance bay. 18-year-old male, motorcycle versus guardrail on Route 9. Suspected femoral bleed, BP dropping, ETA 2 minutes. Claire was already moving before the intercom finished. She flagged down Marcus Webb, the second-year resident who had the unfortunate habit of freezing under pressure, and pointed him toward Bay 4. Get 2 large-bore IVs ready, lactated ringers wide open, and tell someone to page surgery. Don't ask, just page. The attending hasn't... Marcus. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Page surgery. He paged surgery. The kid came through the doors white as chalk, pant legs soaked through, one paramedic holding manual compression with both hands, and the expression of someone who had been doing that for 20 minutes straight and knew they were losing the math. Claire assessed in under 4 seconds. Entry wound high on the inner thigh, exit point absent, meaning the guardrail fragment was likely still inside. Probably nicked the femoral but hadn't fully transected it, which was the only reason the kid was still conscious. "What's your name?" she asked him, snapping gloves on as the gurney rolled. "Danny," he said, and his voice was thin as paper. "Danny, I need you to stay with me. Can you do that?" "Yeah." A pause. "It hurts." "I know. We're going to fix that." She wasn't lying to him. She didn't do that. She just knew something a lot of people in that department had forgotten. That the human body, when treated with speed and precision and without panic, will hold on longer than anyone expects. She had seen far worse than this. She had held far worse than this together with her own 2 hands in places that didn't appear on most maps. She got compression reestablished, called the blood type to the tech at the door, had the ultrasound probe on his thigh inside 90 seconds. The attending on duty, Dr. Harlan Pressler, late 50s, the kind of physician who had been competent for so long he'd mistaken competence for wisdom, appeared at the bay entrance and took one look at the situation. "Get a surgical consult," he said. "Already paged," Claire said without looking up. "Good, I'll take over from Dr. Pressler." She did look up then, briefly, with the ultrasound image already showing her exactly what she suspected. The fragment is 3 centimeters from the vessel wall, and he's tachycardic at 128. If we move him to the OR right now without stabilizing that pressure drop, we're going to lose him in transit. I need 2 more minutes. Pressler hesitated. That hesitation was something she had also learned to read a long time ago. It was the look of a man calculating how much responsibility he wanted to claim. 2 minutes, he said. She used 90 seconds. Danny's pressure was climbing back toward acceptable when the automatic doors at the far end of the ER slammed open with the particular violence of someone who had never once waited for a door to swing on its own. Lieutenant Darren Voss came through first, followed by 2 uniformed officers and a man in a suit whose lanyard said Ashridge PD Liaison. Voss was 6'2", broad across the shoulders, with the kind of jaw that photographs well at press conferences. He was also, Claire noted without looking up from her patient, radiating the specific energy of a man who was furious about something unrelated to whatever he was about to claim was his reason for being here. He crossed the ER floor in 8 strides and stopped at the edge of Bay 4. "I need this area cleared," he said loudly. "This patient is connected to an active homicide investigation." Claire did not look up. "Give me a moment." "I didn't ask for a moment. I said clear the area." "And I heard you." She adjusted the pressure dressing, watched Danny's monitors, checked the clock. "I'm in the middle of stabilizing a patient whose femoral artery is approximately this close to failure, Lieutenant. You can have the room in 90 seconds. You're obstructing a law enforcement investigation." "I'm doing my job." She looked at him then, direct, flat, entirely without the social softening that most people automatically applied when dealing with uniformed authority. "Which is keeping this young man alive. Your investigation will be here when I'm done." Something shifted in Voss's expression. Later, the nurses who were standing at the station across the room would describe it differently. Some said it was the way she looked at him without flinching. Some said it was the particular steadiness of her voice. Some said they didn't know exactly what it was. What they all agreed on was that Voss did not like it. He did not like it at all. "Nurse," he said the word the way some people say nobody. "Step aside. You're way out of your league." "I'll step aside when my patient is stable." He moved before anyone in that room had time to process that he was actually going to do it. 3 steps, 1 motion, palm open, and the sound of it hitting her cheek was flat and hard and wrong in a way that made everyone in the department stop breathing simultaneously. Claire hit the supply cart. Things fell. The room froze. Danny made a small sound of distress on the gurney. Claire straightened slowly. Her hand did not go to her face, though the mark was already blooming red above her jaw. She looked at Voss with an expression that was somehow more unsettling than anger would have been. It was the look of someone cataloging information, filing it, deciding what to do with it later. "You have no idea who you're touching," she said quietly. Voss opened his mouth, and then the roof shook. The sound came down through the ceiling like a physical thing, the hard, rhythmic percussion of military-grade rotor blades, close enough that the overhead lights flickered with the vibration. Several people looked up reflexively. One of Voss's officers took a step backward without meaning to. Claire turned away from Voss entirely, as though he'd already stopped mattering, which, in a sense, he had. She looked at Danny, checked his monitors one final time, pressure at 96/64. Not good, but holding, pulse at 112, better, and spoke to Marcus without raising her voice. "He's stable enough for transport. Get him to surgical. Don't let them wait for me." "Where are you?" "Roof." She pulled off her gloves as she walked, dropped them in the biohazard bin by the door without breaking stride, and was through the stairwell door before the helicopter had fully touched down. Behind her, she heard Voss say something to one of his officers. She didn't catch the words, but the tone was the tone of a man who had not yet understood that the situation had changed. The rooftop was cold in the way that Colorado mountain-adjacent nights are cold, sharp and immediate, with a wind that found every gap in your clothing. The helicopter was military, no civilian markings, angular and matte with the kind of profile that doesn't appear in commercial catalogs. The rotors were still decelerating as the side door opened and the first figure jumped out, a soldier in tactical gear with the efficient, unwasted movements of someone for whom every action has been stripped of anything unnecessary. Behind him came a litter, 2 more soldiers carrying it, and on the litter, a man whose uniform told Claire several things at once before she could read a single name tape. She knew that uniform. She knew what those patches meant. She knew that rank, and she knew, with the particular certainty of someone who has spent years reading bodies under crisis conditions, that this man had maybe 40 minutes before his situation became irreversible. "What happened?" she asked the lead soldier, dropping to her knee beside the litter without ceremony. "Explosion. Forward operating site." He was the closest to the device. The soldier, young, maybe 24, with the kind of eyes that have seen more than they're going to discuss, looked at her with a very deliberate, very controlled expression. "Ma'am, who are you?" "I'm the trauma nurse on duty." She was already working, fingers moving across the commander's torso, reading the damage by touch and what she could see in the floodlights. Blast injury, primary wave, secondary fragmentation, possible tension. Pneumo developing on the left side, and the blood pressure being reported by the field medic at her elbow was considerably too low for a man who was still conscious. Barely conscious, but conscious. The commander's eyes opened, brown, glassy, tracking poorly. His lips moved. "Easy," Claire said. "Don't talk." His hand moved toward her wrist, caught it. Weak grip, but deliberate. His eyes focused on her face with an effort that cost him something, and then something in his expression shifted, recognition, or the ghost of it, and his lips moved again. She couldn't hear him over the rotors. She didn't need to. She had work to do. "We need to get him down to the trauma bay," she said, standing. "Now, Sheb." The elevator descent took 45 seconds. In that time, Claire established what she knew and what she needed. The commander, she hadn't gotten his name yet, hadn't needed it yet, was presenting with a developing hemothorax on the left, possible splenic laceration based on the abdominal rigidity, and a scalp wound that looked worse than it probably was, which was the only mercy in the current inventory. The field medic, a stocky woman named Reyes, who had been working on him since the moment of injury, gave her a fast, clean handoff. No wasted words, just data, and Claire noted this with approval. The doors opened into the ER. Dr. Pressler was waiting. So, unfortunately, was Voss. The lieutenant had not left. He had, if anything, planted himself more firmly in the middle of the department, and he had acquired, in the time Claire had been on the roof, a particular audience. 2 nurses who hadn't felt able to simply walk away, the PD liaison, and one of the surgical residents who had come down from the OR to see what the helicopter noise was about. Voss was speaking into his phone with the tone of someone calling in reinforcements. He saw the litter come through the elevator doors, and for a moment his expression did something complicated. Then he defaulted to what he knew. "This man is connected to move." Claire said it without looking at him, directing the word backward over her shoulder as she walked, because the person she was talking to was behind her, and the litter was already rolling toward Trauma Bay 1. "Move, or I will have security move you. Your choice." "You can't—" "Marcus," Claire said. "On it," Marcus said, and Claire didn't see what happened next because she was already inside Trauma Bay 1, and she didn't need to. Dr. Pressler followed her in. He looked at the commander on the table and then at the 2 soldiers who had come in with the litter and the field medic, Reyes, who was still giving vitals, and his expression went through several phases in rapid succession: surprise, confusion, the particular professional tightening of a physician assessing a difficult case, and then something else. Something that resembled, more than he would have liked, hesitation. "What are we looking at?" he asked. Claire was already pulling up the portable chest unit. "Developing left hemothorax, probable splenic lac, blast wave primary injury. We need to rule out bowel involvement. His pressure's been trending down for the last 20 minutes despite 2 liters of NS in the field. We should get him to— He's not stable for surgery yet." She looked at the soldier who had first spoken to her on the roof. "What blood type?" "O negative." "Get me 4 units, and I need a chest tray." Pressler said, "Claire, if there's a surgical issue, there is definitely a surgical issue," she said, pulling on fresh gloves with the snap of someone who has had this conversation before and is not going to have it long. "But right now I need to decompress this hemothorax before his pressure drops another 10 points and we lose the window. You want to place the chest tube? I will absolutely step back. Otherwise, let me work." Pressler was a competent physician. He had been practicing emergency medicine for 28 years. He had placed hundreds of chest tubes. He looked at the commander's chest X-ray appearing on the portable screen, looked at the monitors, looked at Claire, and made the decision that his ego would argue with later and his clinical training would vindicate. "Work," he said. She worked. The chest tube placement took 4 minutes. In the field, she had done it faster, but the field was the field, and this was a civilian ER with proper equipment, and she was not going to rush a step to prove something to anyone. She talked through it as she went, not for the benefit of the soldiers standing behind the supply line, but for Marcus, who was learning, and for the scrub tech who was new and needed the narration to hand her the right instruments at the right moment. Blunt dissection to the 5th intercostal space, right there. And then we're going to feel our way in above the rib to avoid the neurovascular bundle. Good. And now? The drainage was immediate and substantial and told her what she needed to know about the extent of the bleed. 700 cc's, the tech said, reading the collection chamber. And he's still producing. Claire watched the monitor. The commander's pressure was 84/50 and dropping with a persistence that meant the source hadn't been controlled, which meant the splenic lack she suspected was worse than the imaging was going to show her. "We need the OR now. Tell them we're coming up in 5 minutes." "Already called," Marcus said. She looked at him. He had stopped freezing, she noticed. Somewhere in the last 40 minutes he had stopped freezing entirely and had started just doing things. She filed that away. She was adjusting the drainage system when the ER doors opened again, and this time the energy that came through them was different from Voss's. It was not the energy of a man who had something to prove, but of several people who had already proven everything they needed to prove a long time ago. 3 figures in operational gear, no visible rank insignia on the outer layer, but carrying themselves with the particular authority that doesn't require insignia. 2 were younger, flanking, and the one in the center was a woman in her late 40s, with close-cropped silver hair and the posture of someone who has spent decades making difficult decisions quickly and living with the results. She stopped in the doorway of Trauma Bay 1. She looked at the commander on the table. She looked at Claire. Something moved behind her eyes. Not emotion exactly, or not only emotion. Recognition, perhaps. The acknowledgement of something expected arriving at the worst possible time. She turned to the ER at large. Her voice, when she spoke, had the quality of something that does not need volume to fill a room. "Everyone not essential to this patient's care will clear the area immediately." A pause. "That includes law enforcement personnel." From somewhere behind her, Voss's voice. "Ma'am, I have authority here under—" "You do not." She didn't even turn to look at him. "Special Operations Command has invoked emergency medical jurisdiction under federal statute. This is no longer your scene, Lieutenant." Now she did turn, fractionally, enough to let him see her profile. "Leave. Now." The silence that followed was the silence of a room recalibrating. Voss left. Not quickly. He was not a man who did things quickly when quickness would look like retreat, but he left. The silver-haired woman turned back to Claire. "How is he?" "Alive," Claire said. "For now. I need to get him to the OR in the next 4 minutes." "Then do it." She stepped aside from the doorway, and as she did, Claire moved past her with the gurney. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. "Good to see you, Rowan," the woman said quietly. Too quietly for anyone else to hear. Claire said nothing. She had a patient to save. The hallway to the surgical elevator was 40 feet long, and in those 40 feet, the nature of Claire Rowan's evening changed for the second time. She was aware of Reyes moving alongside her, still monitoring. She was aware of Marcus keeping pace. She was aware of the overhead fluorescents doing that thing where they buzzed slightly at the far end of the hall, the fixture that maintenance had been promising to fix for 3 weeks. She was aware of all these things the way she was always aware of her environment, quietly, completely, in the background, because that kind of awareness had been trained into her so thoroughly that it no longer required conscious effort. What she was also aware of was the sound of Voss's voice carrying from the ER behind her, louder now, having found its second wind. "She struck first. I want that on record. The nurse provoked the situation, and I responded in accordance." The elevator doors opened. Claire stepped in. The doors closed. For 4 seconds, it was just her and Marcus and Reyes and the commander, whose eyes had opened again and who was looking at the elevator ceiling with the distant, effortful focus of someone working very hard to stay conscious. "You're going to be all right," Claire told him. He turned his head toward her. His mouth moved. "Don't," she said, not unkindly. He moved his mouth again anyway, with the specific stubbornness of a man who has given orders his entire adult life and does not stop giving them simply because he is the one in crisis. She leaned slightly closer. "Know you," he managed. "From rest," she said. "Kandahar," he whispered. She straightened. The elevator reached the surgical floor. The doors opened and the OR team was waiting, and Claire moved into the organized urgency of a pre-surgical handoff with everything she had. But for just a moment, one fraction of 1 second, as the gurney rolled past her and she let go of the side rail, something crossed her face that was not the professional composure she had maintained for the last hour. Something older. Something she had wrapped up carefully a long time ago and put somewhere she did not visit, Kandahar. She handed the commander off to the surgical team, gave her report to the attending, crisp, complete, no editorializing, and was turning back toward the elevator when her phone buzzed. Not the work phone. The other one. The personal cell she carried in her left scrub pocket that had rung exactly twice in the past year, both times from numbers that did not display. She looked at the screen. The number was one she hadn't seen in 4 years. She stared at it for 3 full seconds. Then she answered it. "Rowan," she said. The voice on the other end was one she recognized immediately. Low, precise, female, with the faint overlay of someone speaking through encryption software. "We have a situation." "I'm aware," Claire said. "He's in surgery." "That's not the situation I'm calling about." She stopped walking. "The footage from the ER," the voice said. "All of it. The assault, the interference with patient care, the statements Voss made to his officer outside the bay. It's being pulled right now. You need to know that." "Pulled by who?" "By us." A pause. "It was always going to come out, Rowan. He just accelerated the timeline." "And my file?" Another pause. Longer. "That's the other thing," the voice said. Down the hall, through the small window in OR2's door, Claire could see the silhouettes of the surgical team working, moving with the particular controlled urgency of people who knew what they were doing and were doing it at speed. The commander's silhouette, flat on the table, arms extended, surrounded by the organized labor of people trying to keep him alive. She knew what it meant that this call was happening right now. She knew what it meant that they were pulling the footage. She knew what it meant that the silver-haired woman was downstairs in her ER. She had walked away from that world very deliberately, very quietly, through a door she had not expected to walk back through. "What about my file?" she said. And in the silence before the answer came, she felt the door swinging open. "Your file," the voice said, "is being declassified." Claire said nothing for a moment. The OR window was still there, the silhouette still moving, the commander still on the table. She pressed her back against the hallway wall and kept her voice low enough that the 2 nurses passing at the far end wouldn't catch a word. "Who authorized that?" "It came from above my level." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have right now." A brief pause. Not hesitation, more like calculation. "What happened in that ER tonight is already in 3 different incident reports, Rowan. Voss filed one the moment he got outside the building. Hospital administration has one. And the MPs who came in with Colonel Varga's team filed one approximately 11 minutes ago." Colonel Varga. So that was her name now. Claire filed it. "Voss is going to say I provoked him," she said. "He already is saying that. And the footage? Shows exactly what happened, which is why we're pulling it before his people do." The voice dropped a half register. "There are individuals in Voss's chain who would find ways to make that footage complicated. We are not going to allow that." Claire looked down at her hands. She had washed them twice since the chest tube placement, but she could still feel the particular tactile memory of the procedure, the resistance of tissue, the give, the relief of correct placement. Some things you carry in your hands long after they're done. "You said my file, not parts of it." Full service record, sealed commendations, operational history, the Kandahar deployment, all of it. "That was sealed for reasons. The reasons are being reviewed." She laughed, once, without humor. "Reviewed? That's a comfortable word." "Rowan." The voice shifted slightly. Not softer, but more direct in the way that meant what came next was not going to be comfortable. "You were assaulted in a civilian medical facility by a law enforcement officer in front of no fewer than 19 witnesses. That officer is currently attempting to frame that incident as your fault. The man you just saved, assuming surgery goes well, is one of the most decorated field commanders currently on active duty, and his unit brought him to your ER specifically, not the trauma center 12 miles north, yours. The implication sat between them on the encrypted line. They knew I was here, Claire said. It wasn't a question. They've known for 8 months. She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds, then opened them. Is there anything else I need to know tonight? Get some sleep when this is over. Sure, she said, and hung up. She didn't sleep. She went back downstairs. The ER at 1:30 a.m. had settled into the particular register of a department that has survived its crisis and is now processing the aftermath, quieter, but not calm, with the residual tension of a room that still has adrenaline in its walls. Danny, the motorcycle kid, had made it through a successful vascular repair and was in recovery. 3 other patients had come through while Claire was upstairs, all handled, none critical. Marcus was charting at the station with the slightly hollow expression of someone who has gotten through something bigger than expected and hasn't fully caught up to the fact that it's over. He looked up when she came through the door. "Surgery called down," he said. "Commander's out of the immediate danger window. They're saying another hour before they know more." "Good. Also," he hesitated. He was young enough that he still hesitated before delivering unwanted information, which was something he would eventually train out of himself. "Lieutenant Voss is in the administrative wing. He's been in there for about 40 minutes with Director Calloway." Richard Calloway, the hospital's executive director. A man Claire had interacted with exactly 7 times in 2 years of employment, and who had struck her each time as someone primarily concerned with the hospital's exposure to liability rather than its capacity to deliver care. He had attended exactly 0 trauma situations and had sent exactly 1 all-staff memo she remembered, verbatim. "Please be reminded that any interaction with law enforcement personnel should be routed through administration, as unauthorized engagement may create unnecessary institutional risk." She had read that memo, at the time, with the specific tiredness of someone who has seen what actual risk looks like. "How do you know?" she asked Marcus. "Janet saw them go in. She texted me." Janet Briggs was the night shift charge nurse, 53 years old, 26 years in this department, and possessed of a situational awareness that Claire had recognized on her first shift as the product of someone who had learned, the hard way, to always know what was happening 2 rooms over. "Where's Janet now?" Claire asked. "Charge station. Marcus's voice dropped. "She's asking people what they saw, writing things down." Claire looked at him. He was trying to read her expression and getting a careful nothing in return, which was not something she did to be difficult. It was just the only expression she currently had available. "Go finish your charting," she said. She found Janet at the charge station with a legal pad, her handwriting precise and slightly aggressive, the pen moving with the efficiency of someone who had made a decision about what she was doing and was not going to be talked out of it. She was a compact woman with reading glasses she kept on the top of her head and a face that had never really committed to any particular emotional register during work hours. It simply conveyed information. Right now it conveyed focus. She looked up when Claire stopped at the station. "Sit," Janet said. "I'm fine." "I didn't say you weren't. I said sit." She pushed the legal pad half an inch toward Claire. "Read." Claire sat. She read. Janet had written down, in order and with timestamps, the accounts of 11 staff members who had witnessed what happened in Bay 4. The accounts were not identical. Memory isn't, and people observe from different angles. But they converged on the same sequence of events with enough specificity and consistency that any serious investigator would recognize them as real. Voss's hand. The sound. The supply cart. Claire's face. The absence of any provocation preceding the strike. Below the witness accounts, Janet had written a single line. Security footage, Bay 4 camera, corridor camera, north, admitting desk camera. Request preservation immediately. "I called the security office 20 minutes ago," Janet said, watching Claire read. "Told them we needed those files preserved as potential evidence in an incident report. They said they'd need authorization from administration. And I told them the authorization is the incident report I'm filing right now as charge nurse, which is my prerogative under the Employee Safety Policy, Section 4, Paragraph 2, which I have memorized because I wrote the damn training module for it in 2019. She picked up her coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down with the mild frustration of a woman who has been too busy to refill it for an hour. "They preserved the footage." Claire looked at her. Janet looked back. Her expression, for a moment, dropped the professional neutrality it usually maintained and became something more direct. "He hit you, Claire. In front of my department, in front of a patient, in front of people I am responsible for. And now he's upstairs with Calloway." A pause. "I need you to understand that I'm not doing this for your file or your career or whatever is or isn't going on with those soldiers who are currently occupying my family waiting room. I'm doing this because what happened in Bay 4 was wrong. And I have been in this department long enough to know that wrong things have a way of becoming accepted things if nobody writes them down fast enough." Claire was quiet for a moment. "Thank you, Janet," she said. She meant it without any of the performance that sometimes accompanies meaning it, which Janet received without any of the performance that sometimes accompanies receiving it. "Don't thank me yet," Janet said. "Calloway's going to come down here." "I know. And when he does, you need to—" "Janet," Claire stood. "I know." Calloway came down at 2:10 a.m. He was 51, silver at the temples in the way that looks better in photographs than in person, and he was wearing his administrative expression, the one that projected concern while communicating, underneath it, the specific message that the concern was primarily institutional. He had Voss's department liaison with him, the suited man from earlier whose name tag read Dietrich G., and who had the particular quality of someone whose job it is to make things quieter. They found Claire in the nurse's lounge, not because she was resting, but because it was the room with the fewest patients and the best sightlines to the door. "Claire," Calloway said, with the tone of a man using a first name to establish informality he does not feel. "I'm glad you're all right. This has been a very stressful evening." "It has," she agreed. He sat across from her. Dietrich stood near the door in a way that was probably intended to feel neutral, and did not. "I've been speaking with Lieutenant Voss about the incident in the trauma bay," Calloway continued. "He's raised some concerns about the interaction, and I want to make sure we're handling this correctly from an institutional standpoint." "What concerns?" Claire asked. "He feels, and I want to be clear that I'm not making a judgment here, he feels that the situation escalated partly due to some resistance on your part to legitimate law enforcement direction." The word resistance sat in the room. "He struck me," Claire said. Her voice was the same temperature it had been all evening. "In the face, in front of a patient and approximately 19 staff members. That's on camera from 3 angles." Calloway shifted. "The footage is preserved," Claire said, "as of 40 minutes ago, per Section 4 of the Employee Safety Policy." Janet Briggs filed the preservation request. Something moved across Calloway's face. It was not guilt. Men like Calloway rarely experienced guilt in professional settings. But it was the recognition that a move he had been planning to make was no longer available. Dietrich cleared his throat. "Ms. Rowan, we understand your perspective. What we're trying to do here is find a resolution that works for everyone involved. Lieutenant Voss is willing to characterize the incident as a miscommunication if— "A miscommunication," Claire said, "if the hospital agrees to acknowledge that proper procedure for law enforcement interaction wasn't fully followed on the staff side, which would mean—" "He hit me," Claire said again. Same voice, same temperature. "That's not a miscommunication. A miscommunication is when someone doesn't hear a verbal instruction correctly. He raised his hand and struck me in the face while I was treating a critical patient." She looked at Calloway, not Dietrich, because Calloway was the one who actually had the power in this room, and they both knew it. "Are you asking me to— That was my fault?" Calloway's administrative expression held, but something under it moved. "Claire, we have to consider the hospital's position." "I'm considering my position," she said, "which is that I was assaulted. My incident report will say so. Janet's incident report will say so. And 11 witness statements will say so. And the military officers currently in this building are also aware of what occurred." She let that land. "What's the hospital's position on that?" The lounge was very quiet. Calloway said after a moment, "We value your contributions to this department. That's not what I asked." He looked at his hands. It was the look of a man preparing to say something he knew was wrong and had decided to say anyway. "Given the complexity of the situation, the military involvement, the investigation Voss is conducting, the potential liability questions, I think it would be prudent for you to take some time away from the department while we review. You're suspending me." "I'm suggesting a precautionary leave while you review whether I was actually the victim of an assault in your hospital." She stood. She was not raising her voice. She would not raise her voice. "You're suspending the nurse who was struck to protect the reputation of the man who struck her." Calloway said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Dietrich said, "It's not a punitive measure. Get out of my lounge," Janet Briggs said from the doorway. Both men looked at her. Janet had the legal pad under one arm and her phone in her other hand, and the expression of a woman who had been charge nurse for 11 years and had learned exactly what voice to use to make an empty room feel crowded. "This is a staff rest area. Ms. Rowan is staff. You are not." She looked at Calloway with something that was professionally correct and personally withering. "If you have documentation for any action being taken against this employee, you can submit it to HR in the morning. Until then. She held the door open. Calloway stood. He straightened his jacket with the unnecessary precision of a man buying 3 seconds to recover his composure. "We'll talk tomorrow," he said to Claire. "Sure," she said. He left. Dietrich followed. Janet let the door close and exhaled through her nose and set the legal pad on the table. "He's going to suspend you," she said. "He already did. Precautionary leave." "That's suspending you with a bow on it." She sat down across from Claire. "What are you going to do?" Claire looked at the table for a moment. There was a coffee ring on the surface, old and faint, that no one had fully scrubbed out. She thought about the phone call upstairs. She thought about the word declassified. She thought about the commander on the table saying Kandahar with the last air he could spare. "I'm going to wait," she said. "For what?" She looked up. "For the thing that's already in motion." Asham. What was already in motion had started, in practical terms, 47 minutes earlier, in a conference room on the 3rd floor that Redstone Regional used for administrative meetings, and which was currently occupied by 4 people who had not asked anyone's permission to be there. Colonel Marin Varga sat at the head of the table with a tactical laptop open and a satellite phone beside it, and the particular stillness of someone who is doing 3 things simultaneously and showing none of them. Across from her was a man Claire hadn't seen, late 30s, civilian clothes, the kind of posture that goes with spending a lot of time in rooms where things are decided. On Varga's right was the younger soldier from the rooftop, whose name tape, now visible, read Okafor. On her left was a woman in a JAG uniform who had arrived via the stairwell approximately 20 minutes after the helicopter and had introduced herself to no one. The laptop on the table showed, among other things, a split-screen feed. Left side, the surgical theater upstairs, where Commander Ellis Brandt, Claire had the name now from Okafor, who had given it quietly during the elevator ride in the way of someone releasing information on a controlled basis, was currently 3 hours into a procedure that had gone from critical to guarded. Right side, a file. Long. Dense. Mostly black redaction bars, except for the portions that were no longer redacted as of approximately 90 minutes ago. Voss filed his report, the civilian said. He had a tablet. He was reading from it with the expression of someone who has seen many incident reports and can identify bad faith in the first paragraph. He's claiming she made contact with his arm when she turned from the patient, which he interpreted as an aggressive gesture, to which he responded with appropriate force. He's also claiming she was impeding the investigation. Into what? Okafor asked. He hasn't specified. The civilian looked up. Which is interesting, given that he was there to question a witness related to a narcotics case that has nothing to do with this hospital, this patient, or anything that happened tonight, Varga said, without looking up from her own screen. What was he actually doing here? Best current assessment? The civilian set down the tablet. Coincidence. He was here for the witness interview. He saw a situation where he could assert authority, and he asserted it. It went badly. He paused. The problem is that he has friends in the department, and those friends are going to make noise, and if this stays a local matter, the noise might work. It's not a local matter anymore, the JAG officer said. She had not spoken yet, and her voice, when it came, had the quality of a statement that didn't particularly need response. Commander Brandt is active duty special operations personnel who was transported to this facility under military emergency protocols. The assault on a treating medical professional in an active military emergency situation falls under federal jurisdiction. She looked at the civilian. That's not an argument. That's a statute. Voss will argue she's civilian. She is civilian. The JAG officer said it the way you say something that is technically true and entirely beside the point. Her status is a separate question from the jurisdiction of the incident. Varga closed one of the tabs on her laptop and opened another. The room's overhead light caught the silver in her hair and made it look like something deliberate. What's the timeline on the file? Authorization came through at 11:58. Processing takes, I know how long it takes. I'm asking when it's done. The civilian checked his phone. Approximately 4 hours from now. Full record. Operational history, commendations, the Kandahar deployment and its associated classified after-action reports. Okafor, who was young enough that he had not entirely eliminated all visible reaction from his face, looked at the civilian. The full Kandahar file? I thought that was... It was, Varga said. Now it isn't. Why now? She looked at him. It was the look of a person deciding how much context a question deserves. "Because it became necessary," she said. "That's enough." Okafor nodded and did not ask again, which was how she knew he was going to be fine. The phone on the table buzzed. Varga answered it, listened for 20 seconds, said, "Understood," and hung up. "Calloway is trying to put Rowan on administrative leave," she said. The JAG officer looked up from her own notes for the first time. "On what basis?" "Vague enough to be flexible." Varga's expression did not change in any way that could be easily described. "He's doing what people in his position do when they're afraid. He's trying to move the problem sideways before anyone official asks him about it." "She's not going to accept it," the civilian said. He said it not as a prediction, but as the statement of a known fact, the way you'd say water is wet. "No," Varga agreed. "She's not." "So what do we do?" Varga picked up her satellite phone. "We make a call," she said, "to someone who outranks everyone currently making noise in this building." She dialed. It rang twice. "General," she said, "I need 5 minutes." Claire didn't know about the call. She didn't know about the conference room on the 3rd floor, or the JAG officer's notes, or the file that was currently being processed through the declassification system in a federal building 3 states away. She knew what she knew, which was the ER, and the footage, and Janet's legal pad, and the particular cold clarity that had settled over her since the moment on the surgical floor when she had understood that the door she had closed behind her 4 years ago was being opened from the other side. She was standing at the sink in the nurse's lounge, washing her face. The mark on her cheek had gone from red to something more settled, a deep bruise forming beneath the surface that would look significantly worse in the morning when her personal cell buzzed again. Not the encrypted number this time. A text from a number she didn't recognize, which was how certain people communicated with her because certain people did not put their names in contact lists. The text was 4 words: "Stay in the building." She looked at it for a long moment. Then she put the phone back in her pocket, dried her face, and walked back out to the department. The ER at 3 a.m. was operating on skeleton staff, 2 nurses covering the floor, 1 resident dozing at the back station, Janet still at the charge desk because Janet apparently did not go home until whatever was happening finished happening. 2 of Voss's uniformed officers were still in the building, in the waiting area, doing the uncomfortable thing uniformed officers do when they're present but have no authority, occupying space without purpose, checking their phones, occasionally exchanging a few words with each other and then going back to checking their phones. Claire sat at the secondary charting station and opened the incident report template. She wrote carefully, not angrily. Anger makes you imprecise, and imprecision gives people things to argue about. She wrote the way she had been trained to write reports in a context she never talked about, with specificity, with sequence, with the kind of detail that makes a document solid rather than emotional. Time of initial contact with patient, time of Lieutenant Voss's entry. Exact words, as she recalled them. Time of the physical contact, description of the physical contact, physical location of both parties. List of witnesses by badge number. She was on the 7th paragraph when the department doors opened and 4 people she had never seen walked in. Not soldiers. Not police. 2 men and 2 women in civilian clothes, but carrying the kind of credentials that they produced immediately and held long enough to be read. And Claire, from 20 feet away, could see the header on one of them clearly enough. Office of the Inspector General, Department of Defense. The taller of the 2 men went directly to Voss's officers in the waiting area. The shorter one went to the charge desk. One of the women came toward Claire. She was maybe 35, with the precise and slightly exhausted look of someone who has been doing very serious work for a long time and has developed a professional relationship with inconvenient hours. She stopped at the edge of Claire's station and showed her credentials without being asked. "Miss Rowan," she said, "my name is Special Investigator Dana Forthright. I need to speak with you about what occurred here tonight." Claire looked at her. Then she looked across the ER to where Voss's second officer was now standing very still while the taller IG investigator spoke to him in the particular low tone that investigators use when they're not asking questions yet, but want you to know they will be. Then she looked back at Forthright. "I'm finishing my incident report," Claire said. "Give me 10 minutes. Forthright, to her credit, simply said, "Take your time," and sat down in the chair beside the station and waited. From the administrative wing, down the long corridor that connected it to the ER, came the sound of a door opening. Then voices. Then the specific vocal register of a man who has just been told something he did not expect and is not yet sure how to react to it. Richard Calloway's voice. And then another voice. One Claire recognized, low and precise, and accustomed to being heard the first time. Colonel Marin Varga had come downstairs, and from the look on the face of the uniformed officer by the door, who had just seen the credentials of the 4 people now occupying his waiting area, Lieutenant Darren Voss's version of this night was running out of room. Claire heard Calloway's voice crack on a syllable, just one, just for a second, and then recover into the register of a man trying to sound like the conversation was still going the way he expected. It wasn't. She could hear it from 40 feet away through a corridor wall, which meant Varga wasn't moderating her volume, which meant Varga had decided that Calloway no longer warranted that particular courtesy. Claire filed that information alongside everything else she was filing and kept writing. Sequence. Timestamps. Witness badge numbers. The exact pressure and location of the contact to her face, described in clinical language because clinical language is what holds up. Forthright sat beside her and did not speak, which was the correct move and suggested she was good at her job. The incident report took 11 minutes instead of 10 because Claire caught herself writing, "The patient was stable" when she meant the patient had been stabilized, and precision mattered enough to fix it. When she was done, she read it back once, changed 2 words, and submitted it through the hospital's system, and then photographed each page with her personal phone, because she had learned, in context she did not discuss, that documents had a way of becoming temporarily unavailable when they contained inconvenient things. "Done," she said. Forthright had a recorder and a notepad both, which was the redundancy of someone who had been burned by a single-point failure before. "I need to walk you through the evening chronologically," she said. "Everything you remember in sequence, including the moments you're not sure about. If you're not sure, tell me you're not sure. Don't reconstruct." "I know how to give a statement," Claire said. A pause. Forthright looked at her, not offended, reassessing. "Right," she said. "Then let's go." They went. Claire talked for 22 minutes without interruption. She had the kind of memory that functions better under stress than without it, something she had recognized about herself years ago without particularly wanting to, and she gave Forthright the evening in the order it happened, with the gaps labeled as gaps and the uncertainties labeled as uncertainties. She described Voss's entry. She described his language. She described the physical contact with the precision of a medical professional describing an injury, which it was. When she got to the roof and the commander's arrival, Forthright's pen slowed but didn't stop. When she got to the phone call in the surgical corridor, she paused. "There was a call," she said. "On my personal cell. I'm not going to tell you who from, and I'm not going to tell you what was said because that falls under a category I'm not able to discuss without authorization you don't currently have," Forthright said, without looking up. "Correct. Noted." She wrote something. "Continue." When Claire finished, Forthright closed the notepad and turned off the recorder and sat for a moment in the way of someone sorting what they've been given into categories. "The footage from the 3 cameras," she said. "You said it was preserved. As of approximately 1:15 a.m. I'm going to need to take that into federal custody." She said it to the room as much as to Claire, in the tone of someone making a note rather than asking permission. "Voss's department has already formally requested copies through the Ashridge PD liaison." "I know, Dietrich. The request was received about an hour ago. The hospital's legal office is apparently trying to determine who they're obligated to comply with. And who are they?" Forthright looked at her steadily. "Us," she said. "The answer is us. But that determination takes paperwork, and paperwork takes time, and in the meantime, the footage needs to be somewhere it can't be touched," Claire said. "It already is," Forthright said. "We moved fast tonight." She stood, collected her recorder and notepad with the economy of movement that comes from doing this very often. "One more thing. You're going to be approached, possibly tonight, possibly tomorrow, by people who represent Lieutenant Voss's interests. They're going to offer you things and tell you things, and some of what they tell you is going to be technically true. I need you to understand that technically true is not the same as actually true, and that anything you agree to in the next 72 hours while you are, technically, a victim in an active federal investigation could complicate your position. You're telling me not to make deals. I'm telling you, the deals that get offered to victims at 3 in the morning in hospital break rooms are rarely designed with the victim in mind. Claire looked at her. Did anyone tell you about what Calloway tried to offer me? We're thorough, Forthright said, and left it at that. The corridor connecting the administrative wing to the ER had a particular acoustic quality that the hospital's architects had probably not intended. Sound carried down it in the low hours of the night with a clarity that daytime noise levels obscured. Claire became aware of this for the second time when Varga's voice reached the ER in a fragment. Not a request, Mr. Calloway, and then was cut off by a door closing. Then the door opened again. Then Calloway appeared at the end of the corridor, walking fast, with the compressed expression of a man who has just had an argument he did not win and is deciding how to present that to himself. He stopped when he saw the 4 IG investigators in his ER. He looked at Claire. He looked at Forthright, who was standing near the exit with her notepad and the particular air of someone who has everything she came for. He looked back at Claire. We'll need to revisit our earlier conversation, he said. Yes, Claire said. We will. He went into his office. The door closed with the careful quietness of someone who wanted to slam it and had decided against it. Varga came around the corner 2 minutes later, walking at a different pace. Not fast, not slow, exactly as fast as she needed to be. She looked at the IG investigators with the acknowledgement of people who are on the same side of something and don't need to perform collegiality about it. Then she came to the charting station. Surgical floor says he's stable, she said. Post-op, ICU in approximately 20 minutes. Claire exhaled through her nose. It was not a dramatic exhale. It was the release of a specific tension that had been occupying a specific place in her chest since the roof. Good, she said. He's going to want to see you when he wakes up. Probably. He remembers you. He said a word. I don't know how much he remembers. Varga looked at her with the expression of someone who knows something is being understated and is choosing not to press it. He asked for you by name before they put him under, she said. Full name. Claire didn't say anything. You didn't tell anyone here, Varga said. Not an accusation, more like an observation being placed on a table for examination. I didn't see the reason to. You saved a man's life tonight using procedures that are not in the civilian nursing curriculum, Claire. People noticed. People were busy. Reyes noticed. She's been doing this for 11 years. She said she's never seen a civilian place a trauma chest tube that fast outside of a sim lab. Varga's voice was level, informational, not building toward anything theatrical. Pressler noticed. He's going to be asked about it. He can say what he saw. Which is what, from your perspective? Claire looked at her hands on the keyboard. The coffee ring on the table surface. The faint buzz from the overhead light at the far end of the ER that still hadn't been fixed. A nurse who knew what she was doing, she said. Varga was quiet for a moment. The file is going to be processed by approximately 7 a.m., she said. When it is, it will be available to the investigative teams, to the JAG office, to the hospital administration, and under the terms of the declassification order, to the general record, which means it will be available to you. Claire looked at her. It's my file. It was sealed. I signed the sealing. You signed it under circumstances that are being reviewed as part of the broader declassification. Varga met her gaze and held it. You may feel when you read it that it should have been available sooner. I'm not going to argue with that. What I'm going to feel, Claire said carefully, is a conversation I'm not having at 3 a.m. in this ER. Fair, Varga said. Fair, Varga said. She stood. Get some rest when you can. Tomorrow's going to be longer than tonight. You said that before. I meant it before, too. She walked back toward the corridor, and Claire watched her go and thought about all the things she didn't say, which was a list she had been maintaining for 4 years, and which had gotten considerably more complicated in the last 4 hours. The ICU on Redstone Regional's 4th floor was 8 beds behind a set of double doors that required keycard access, and the overnight staff there had been told by 3 separate people in the last hour that the patient in bed 6 was not to have visitors, except those cleared through the military officers currently occupying the 3rd floor conference room. This was unusual enough that the night shift ICU charge, a quiet man named Gordon Theus, who had been working this floor for 15 years, had written it down in the unit log and then written it down again on a sticky note attached to the monitor, because he was a belt and suspenders kind of person. Commander Ellis Brandt came out of anesthesia at 4:23 a.m. It was not a clean emergence. It rarely was after this length of surgery, this degree of trauma, this much blood loss replaced. The brain comes back in pieces, not all at once, and the pieces don't always arrive in the right order. He surfaced through what the anesthesiologist would later describe as significant agitation, which was the clinical way of saying he tried twice to remove his own IV before Theus got his hands down, and the sedation was titrated back up enough to keep him still without putting him back under. He said two things during that first emergence. Theus wrote both of them down, because he was that kind of person. The first was a location. The second was a name. At 5:15 a.m., when Brandt came back more cleanly and lay still with the monitors showing everything in its expected range, and the particular exhausted blankness of a man who knows he's in a hospital and has decided to accept that for the moment, Okafor came in and sat beside the bed and said very little, which was the right call. Brandt looked at the ceiling for a while. Then he looked at Okafor. "Rowan," he said. His voice was the voice of someone operating at reduced capacity. Slow, effortful, but tracking. "She's in the building," Okafor said. "Is she?" He stopped, reassembled. What happened to her? It was not quite a question. Okafor understood this. There was an incident in the ER when you came in. She's... I heard something. Brandt's eyes moved to the ceiling again. On the way in, I heard something. You were in and out of consciousness. I heard it. He was quiet for a moment. His hand on top of the blanket curled slightly. Who? Local PD, lieutenant named Voss. The hand uncurled, curled again. Where is he now? Building, Okafor said. IG has him. Good. Brandt closed his eyes, opened them. She placed the chest tube. Yes, sir. I was conscious for part of it. He said this with the faint, wondering quality of someone who has run the math and is still a little surprised by the result. She talked the whole time, calm. Like, he stopped again. Like she'd done it before, Okafor said. Yeah. A pause. She has. I know. The file. Being processed. 7 a.m. Approximately. Brandt's eyes closed again, and this time they stayed closed. Not unconsciousness, but something close to it. The body pulling rank on the mind, insisting on rest in a way that could not be argued with. Okafor sat with him in the particular silence of people who have been through things together or near things together and don't need to perform connection because it's simply there. At 6:08 a.m., Brandt said, without opening his eyes, "She's going to hate this." Probably, Okafor agreed. Make sure she's in the building when it comes through. She hasn't left. A long pause. She wouldn't, Brandt said. Then he was asleep. Claire was not sleeping. She had found the supply closet on the second floor that had a chair in it, one of the old padded ones that had been moved out of a patient room during the last renovation and never quite made it to disposal. And she sat in it with her incident report on her phone and her eyes closed, not sleeping, doing the things she had learned to do years ago when sleep wasn't available, but rest was necessary, shutting down everything except the awareness of the room, the body's temperature, the slow regulation of breath. It wasn't sleep. It was the next best thing. Her cheek throbbed. The bruise had fully formed now. She'd seen it in the bathroom mirror at around 4 a.m., and it was the kind of bruise that photographs with specificity, which she recognized was going to be relevant and had documented accordingly, angling her phone camera in the fluorescent light of the women's restroom with the methodical detachment of someone gathering evidence rather than confronting an injury. She had been sitting in the supply closet for 40 minutes when the door opened. She was on her feet before it fully swung, and Marcus Webb, who had come to deliver what was clearly going to be information of some kind, took an involuntary step backward. "Sorry," he said. "Sorry. Janet said you might be." "It's fine." She sat back down. He hovered in the doorway with the particular manner of someone uncertain whether to enter. "Come in or don't, Marcus." He came in. There was no other chair, so he stood with his back to the door in the way of a resident who has not yet figured out how to occupy a room without looking like he's waiting for permission to leave it. "Surgery called the ICU," he said. "Commander's post-op status is, I know, Varga told me." "Right." He looked at his shoes, then at her face. He visibly noticed the bruise. He'd seen it before. He'd been in the room when it happened, but something about this hour and this lighting made it land differently on him. That's... He stopped himself. It looks worse than it is, she said, which was not entirely true, but was what she had decided to say until she had time to decide what she actually thought about it. Is it... Are you okay? Not medically, I mean, Marcus. Yeah. Thank you for asking. She meant it the same way she'd meant it with Janet, without the ceremony. I'm okay. He nodded. He was about to leave, she could see it, and then he didn't. He stood for another 3 seconds with the expression of someone who has decided to say a thing they weren't sure they were going to say. When you were working on him, he said, the commander, the way you placed that tube, I've seen attendings who can't do it that cleanly, and the way you read the ultrasound, and the way you... He stopped. Started again. I've been in this department for 8 months, and I've never seen anybody work like that. And I don't know what that means. I don't know what's in your... He stopped again, correctly, because he'd reached the edge of what he actually knew. I just wanted to say that I saw it. Claire looked at him. In another context, from another person, this might have felt like the prelude to something. An ask, an implied transaction, the kind of recognition that comes with strings. For Marcus, it felt like what it was. A 27-year-old resident who had watched something happen and needed to say so out loud, because not saying it felt dishonest. Get some rest, she said. Morning shift's in 90 minutes. Yeah. He pushed off the door. Claire? Yeah. Whatever's in that file, it doesn't change what I saw tonight. He left before she could respond to that, which was probably the right instinct. She sat in the chair for another 10 minutes and then went back to the ER, because the supply closet chair, it turned out, was not as comfortable as it looked. At 6:47 a.m., Lieutenant Darren Voss made a mistake. It was not his first of the evening, but it was the one that removed the remaining space he had to maneuver in. He had been in the hospital's administrative wing for most of the night, first with Calloway, then with Dietrich, then in a small meeting room where he had spent approximately 2 hours on the phone with various people in his department who were no longer returning his calls with the speed they had returned them 4 hours ago. The IG investigators had spoken with him twice, briefly, in the manner of people who already had most of what they needed, and were conducting the courtesy of allowing him to speak before they proceeded without him. At 6:47 a.m., he walked out of the administrative wing, down the main corridor, and into the ER. He was looking for Claire. What he found first was Janet Briggs, who was still at the charge desk and who looked up at him with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for this exact moment and is entirely ready for it. Lieutenant, she said, this is a restricted patient care area. Do you have a clinical reason to be here? I need to speak with the nurse, Rowan. Miss Rowan is an employee of this department currently on a precautionary administrative status, which means any contact with her needs to go through. I'm not interested in your administrative process. I'm aware of that, Janet said, her voice exactly the same temperature it had been, which is why I'm documenting this interaction. She held up her phone. She was, in fact, recording. For the incident file. Voss looked at the phone. Something moved through his expression. Not fear, not yet, but the recognition that a thing he had planned to do was going to cost more than he'd budgeted for. He took a step toward the corridor anyway. Lieutenant Voss. The voice came from the doorway behind him. He turned. Special Investigator Forthright was standing in the entrance to the ER, with the other 3 IG investigators flanking her at loose intervals that were professionally casual and practically not casual at all. She had her notepad, she had her credentials visible at her collar, and she had the expression of someone who is about to say something they have been waiting to say for approximately 3 hours. I need you to come with me, she said. We have follow-up questions. I've answered your questions. You've answered some of them. She held the door. There are more. Voss stood for a moment with the specific stillness of a man assessing whether he had any remaining options and arriving, gradually, at the correct answer. He looked at Janet. He looked at the corridor behind him. He looked at Forthright. Then he walked toward her because there was nothing else to do. He was halfway through the door when his radio crackled, his personal department radio, which he'd kept on his belt the entire night. And the voice that came through it was his sergeant's voice, with the flat, careful cadence of someone delivering information they are not happy to deliver. Darren, call me. Just call me directly. Don't go through dispatch. Voss stopped. Forthright waited. He looked at the radio. He looked at her. Now, she said quietly. He went. Claire heard none of this directly. She was in Trauma Bay 3 when it happened, checking on a patient who had come in at 6:30. Older woman, chest pain, ultimately a panic attack, but presenting initially in a way that required ruling out cardiac involvement, which she had done with the same careful speed she applied to everything. The patient, a 67-year-old retired schoolteacher named Vera, had been frightened and then relieved and was now sitting up with juice and a warm blanket, talking about her daughter in Denver with the voluble gratitude of someone who has just been scared back into conversation. Claire was charting the encounter when her personal phone buzzed. The number was Forthright's, but they had exchanged contacts after the statement. The text said, "He's in custody. Formal arrest in approximately 45 minutes pending coordination. Don't go anywhere." She read it twice. Then she kept charting. Vera from the bed said, "You look like you've been here all night." "I have," Claire said. "You should go home. Soon." "Is everything all right? You look—" Vera paused delicately. "You have a bruise." "It's nothing." "That's not nothing, honey." Claire looked at her. Vera had the expression of a woman who had spent 40 years in a classroom and could identify a practiced deflection at 100 yards. She also had the expression of someone who was genuinely concerned without any agenda attached to it, which was rarer than it should have been. "It was a long night," Claire said. "I can see that." Vera looked at her hands, at the juice cup, back at Claire. "I've been a teacher long enough to know when someone's been treated badly and is pretending they're fine." A pause. "I'm sorry it happened." The words were so simple and so unperformed that Claire had to look away for a moment. "Thank you," she said. Then, "Drink your juice." She was finishing the chart entry when the overhead announcement system activated. Not the emergency tone, not a code, but the general address tone used for administrative announcements, which almost never happened before 8 a.m., and which brought every person in the ER briefly to a stop. "Attention all Redstone regional staff. This is an announcement from hospital administration. Effective immediately, all media inquiries regarding events of the previous evening should be directed to the communications office. Additionally, staff are reminded that the hospital's employee assistance program is available 24 hours a day. That is all." Claire stared at the overhead speaker for 2 full seconds. Then Janet's voice from across the room, very dry. "Well, that tells us something." It told them that administration had become aware that the media was going to be a problem, which meant the media was already a problem, which meant whatever was happening in the building had reached a threshold where it was no longer containable by quiet internal management. Claire's phone buzzed again. This time, it was the encrypted number. She stepped out of the bay, into the corridor, and answered. "The file's early," the voice said. "Processing finished at 6:52. It's been transmitted to the investigative teams, JAG, and the declassification registry." A pause. "It's also been transmitted, per the terms of the order, to you." Claire stopped walking. "Check your secure email," the voice said. "The one you haven't opened in 4 years." "I know which one." "There's one additional item." A pause that had weight behind it. "The Kandahar After Action Report. It's in there, all of it, including the official record of what happened in the building." She said nothing. "Claire." First name. The voice almost never used her first name. "It's accurate. Whatever you remember, it's in there, and it's accurate, and it says what happened, not what was convenient, what happened." She was standing in the corridor outside Trauma Bay 3, one hand on the wall that she didn't quite need for support but was touching anyway, and the fluorescent light at the far end was still buzzing, still unfixed, still the low persistent problem that nobody had gotten around to solving. "Okay," she said. "There's one more thing," the voice said. "Of course there is. Commander Brandt is awake, asking for you, and—" The voice paused in a way that was unusual. The voice did not usually pause. "There are reporters outside the building. 3 networks, 2 print. Voss's sergeant leaked something to a contact about 2 hours ago. We don't know the full shape of what he said, but the cameras are there." "What did he leak?" "We're not certain, but given the timing and the source, our best assessment is that he told them there was a confrontation between a nurse and a law enforcement officer, and framed it in a way that is going to require correction." Claire closed her eyes. 3 networks, 2 print. Voss's version of the night seeded into the press before the actual version had time to establish itself. "Rowan," the voice said, "the file is out, the footage is secured, Brandt is awake. The IG has Voss." A pause. "But the next 2 hours are going to determine what this looks like publicly, and right now the only person in that building who can determine that is me," she said. "Yes." She opened her eyes. Down the corridor, the elevator doors opened and Okafor stepped out, moving with the quiet purpose of someone carrying a message in person, because the message was too important for a text. He saw her. He stopped. He looked at her face, the bruise, the stillness in her expression, the particular quality of someone who has just received information and is processing what it requires of them. And he said nothing, because he read the situation correctly in under 2 seconds, and understood that what she needed right now was not someone talking at her. She looked at him. He held up a single keycard, ICU access. She said into the phone, "I'll call you back." She hung up. She looked at the keycard in Okafor's hand and at the elevator behind him, and at the corridor leading to the ER where Janet was still at the charge desk, and Vera was still drinking juice, and Voss was somewhere in this building being walked toward a formal arrest, and the cameras were outside and the file was out, and Brandt was awake and asking for her. She thought about 4 years. She thought about the door she had closed. She thought about the way Marcus had said I saw it with the sincerity of someone who hadn't yet learned to qualify his observations, and the way Vera had said, "I'm sorry it happened," without any performance attached. She took the key card, and as she walked toward the elevator, her phone buzzed one more time. Not the encrypted line, not Forthright, not any of the numbers she had been tracking all night. Her hospital-issued phone, the department-wide communication system. A message from the surgical floor, time-stamped 7:04 a.m. Patient Brandt, E. Requesting specific staff member for ICU visit clearance. Name on file, Rowan, C. Authorization required from attending and military liaison. Both have confirmed, awaiting her response. She was already in the elevator, the doors closed, and on the second floor in the small conference room adjacent to the administrative wing, Richard Calloway was opening his laptop to a news alert that had just hit 4 local outlets simultaneously. A story with a headline that contained Claire's name and Voss's name and the words "alleged assault in military and cover-up," with a photograph taken through the ER window sometime in the night that showed, in grainy and unmistakable clarity, the exact moment Voss's hand connected with her face. Someone had leaked the footage. Not Voss's people. Not Calloway's people. The leak had come from inside the hospital, from a direction no one had been watching, in a format that the communications office had not been prepared for and could not now contain. And in Calloway's conference room, the phone began to ring, and it did not stop. Calloway's phone rang 11 times in 4 minutes, and he answered none of them correctly. That was the assessment of his own communications coordinator, a 29-year-old named Priya Santosh, who had taken the job 8 months ago because hospital PR seemed like a stable career and had spent the last 40 minutes discovering the limits of that assumption. She stood in the doorway of his office and watched him pick up the third call, say, "We're looking into it," to whoever was on the line, and hang up before they could respond. And she understood in that moment that the situation had moved beyond what Calloway's instincts were equipped to handle. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "we need a statement. Not in an hour. Now." "I'm aware. The footage is on 3 local stations' websites. 2 of them have it autoplaying on the homepage." She held up her phone. He didn't look at it. She put it down. "The AP has picked it up. That means national in approximately 20 minutes. He finally looked at her. His face had the specific quality of a man whose internal model of a situation has just collided with reality at speed and has not yet finished processing the impact. "Who released it? We had it preserved under—" "It wasn't released from our system," Priya said. "Our security office confirmed the preservation was intact. Whoever leaked it had access to a copy that wasn't in our custody." Calloway sat back in his chair. The physics of this were settling over him in layers. Someone in the hospital had recorded the footage independently, or had access to a copy made before the preservation order, and had made a decision, sometime in the night, to put it somewhere it couldn't be pulled back. "Get legal on the phone," he said. "Legal is already on hold on line 2. They've been on hold for 6 minutes because you keep taking other calls." He looked at line 2 on his desk phone, blinking with the patience of people being paid by the hour. Priya said, with the careful neutrality of someone who has decided to be more useful than diplomatic. Mr. Calloway, our statement needs to make clear that the hospital condemns what's visible in that footage and that we are cooperating fully with the federal investigation. If the first thing we say publicly is anything other than that, it will look like we're protecting Voss, and the footage makes protecting Voss— She stopped, picked the right word. Untenable. He looked at her for a long moment. Write the statement, he said. She was already typing. Whoa. The elevator opened on the 4th floor, and Claire stepped out into the controlled quiet of the ICU corridor, which had a different temperature from the ER. Literally cooler, and also acoustically different, the sounds damped down to monitors and ventilation, and the occasional soft exchange between staff who had learned to speak at volumes that didn't carry. Okafor walked beside her without speaking, which she appreciated. The key card he'd given her was still in her hand. Thais, the charge nurse, met them at the double doors. He looked at Claire's face, the bruise, with the brief involuntary assessment of a clinical person clocking an injury, and then he looked away, which was also the right move. He's been awake for about an hour, Thea said, holding the door. He's oriented, he's tracking, and he has asked for you 4 times, which for someone who came out of a 6-hour surgery 8 hours ago is— He seemed to search for the right word. Persistent. That's accurate, Okafor said, without inflection. The ICU had 8 beds arranged around a central monitoring station, 6 of them occupied. Bed 6 was at the far end, half screened by a curtain that had been partially drawn for the IV access that was no longer needed, and then never fully pulled back. Claire could see the monitor before she could see the patient, rhythm regular, pressure better than she had any right to expect given the night, oxygen saturation sitting at 96% and holding. She pulled back the curtain. Ellis Brandt looked, in the generous light of the ICU at 7 in the morning, like a man who had been through significant violence and had declined to be finished by it. I was broad through the shoulders in the way that surgical draping doesn't entirely conceal, and the compression bandaging on his left side was visible above the blanket edge, and he had the particular color of someone who has received a lot of blood products in a short time. Not quite right, but not the chalk white of the ER gurney either. His eyes were open. They tracked to her immediately and stayed there. Rowan, he said. Commander. She moved to the bedside, checked the monitor once from habit, looked at him. How's your pain? Manageable. His voice was stronger than she expected. Rough, but present. Stop looking at the monitor. I'm a nurse. You're the reason I'm alive. You can look at me like a person for 30 seconds. She pulled the chair close and sat. This was, she thought, probably the first time in the last 8 hours she had sat down and actually intended to stay in the seat. He studied her face. She let him, because looking away would have been its own kind of statement, and she was tired of making statements she didn't mean. That happened here, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. While you were working on me. Before. While I was working on another patient. His jaw tightened slightly. It was the only visible sign of what he thought about that, and it was controlled within 2 seconds. Okafor told me Voss is with the IG. As of about an hour ago. Good. He was quiet for a moment. His hand on top of the blanket moved. Not toward her, just moved. The slight restlessness of a body that has been still for too long by medical necessity. I need to tell you something. You need to rest. I've been resting for 6 hours. I need to tell you something. He waited until she looked at him directly. When Varga's team made the call to bring me here, to this hospital, specifically, I was the one who said your name. Claire said nothing. I've known where you were for about 14 months, he continued. Not because anyone was watching, because I asked. After everything, he stopped. The effort of sustained speech was costing him something, and he was managing it carefully, rationing the energy. I wanted to know you were all right. You could have called. You'd sealed the file. That means you wanted distance. I respected that. She looked at the window at the end of the bay, not looking at anything, just a place to put her eyes for a moment that wasn't his face. Outside it was getting light in the thin, specific way of high-altitude early mornings, the sky going from black to a dark blue that hadn't committed to anything yet. The file's out, she said. I know. All of it. I know. A pause. How do you feel about that?
She thought about how to answer that honestly. I haven't read it yet, she said. I've been busy. Something moved in his expression that might, in other lighting, have been the beginning of a smile. Yeah, he said. I heard.
She stayed 20 minutes, which was 10 minutes longer than she'd planned, and 10 minutes shorter than he probably needed. And when she left, she took the stairs back down because the elevator felt slow, and she needed to move. Her body had that particular quality of extended wakefulness, where it had stopped asking for sleep and had simply made a separate peace with its current state, which she knew from experience was not sustainable past about hour 32, and she was currently at hour 29. The stairwell had a window on each landing. On the third-floor landing, she stopped and looked out at the parking lot. There were 3 media vans visible from this angle, with more arriving. She could see the slow, steady convergence of vehicles with roof equipment, the particular circus geometry of a developing press situation. 2 uniformed officers she didn't recognize were managing a perimeter at the main entrance. Not Ashridge PD, different patches. She pulled out her phone and opened the email account she hadn't opened in 4 years. The inbox had 47 unread messages from the past 4 years, most of them automated. Security alerts, system notifications, a handful of messages from an address she recognized as an administrative relay that she had never responded to and which had eventually stopped sending. And at the top, time-stamped 6:52 a.m., a message with an attachment. The subject line said, "Declassification complete. Rowan C. Full record." She stared at it. Then she downloaded the attachment to her phone, locked the screen, and put the phone back in her pocket. Not yet. She would read it when she was somewhere that wasn't a stairwell window, and she had something close to the right mental space to process what was in it, which was not now. She went back to the ER. At 8:15 a.m., Lieutenant Darren Voss was formally placed under arrest in the third-floor conference room of Redstone Regional Medical Center by Special Investigator Forthright, with 2 federal officers present and the JAG officer from Varga's team as witness. The charges, as read, were assault and battery on a civilian in the course of medical care delivery, obstruction of a federal military medical emergency, abuse of law enforcement authority, and this last one arrived with the particular weight of something that had been built carefully over the preceding hours. Falsification of an official incident report, specifically the report Voss had filed at 1:03 a.m., claiming that Claire had initiated physical contact. The security footage from 3 angles made that last charge straightforward. The footage had been authenticated by the hospital's security contractor at 7:30 a.m. and transmitted to the IG's office, and the footage showed, without ambiguity and from multiple perspectives, exactly what had happened in Bay 4 at 11:58 p.m. Voss's entry, his verbal confrontation with a nurse actively treating a patient, and then the strike, preceded by no physical action from Claire, followed by nothing except the supply cart and scattered equipment and the mark on her face. Voss said, when the charges were read, "This is a mistake." Forthright said, "They often are," and proceeded with the documentation. He was walked out of the building through a side entrance, which was a courtesy that he had not extended to the nurse he'd struck in her own department in front of her own staff, and which the IG office provided anyway because it was the procedure, and the procedure existed independent of what people deserved. The media didn't get the exit footage, but 2 members of the hospital staff who happened to be in the parking structure saw it, and one of them had a phone, and by 9 a.m., a photograph of Voss in handcuffs outside the staff entrance of Redstone Regional was circulating in a way that no communications coordinator could contain. Calloway's statement went out at 8:40 a.m. Priya had written it in 12 minutes, and he had changed 4 words, none of them improving it. It condemned the assault unequivocally, stated the hospital's full cooperation with the federal investigation, and announced the suspension with pay of 2 members of the administrative team pending review of their conduct during the overnight hours, which was the careful language for the fact that both Calloway himself and the legal coordinator, who had been in the room when Claire was pushed toward a forced leave, were now being reviewed for their own role in attempting to manage the incident in Voss's favor. Calloway did not include his own name in the suspension announcement. That oversight would be corrected by the hospital board at 10 a.m., in a meeting that had been called at 6 a.m. by 3 board members who had seen the news alert on their phones over breakfast and had made calls to each other with the speed of people who understand liability. Claire was not watching any of this directly. She was in the ER, working, because the ER did not stop requiring nursing care, because the institutional world above it was restructuring itself, and because working was what she did when everything else was uncertain. She had 3 patients between 8 and 10 a.m., a child with a laceration above the eyebrow that needed 4 sutures, and whose fear she managed by asking him about his soccer team, an elderly man with elevated blood pressure and the specific anxiety of someone who had driven himself to the hospital because he didn't want to bother anyone, and a young woman with abdominal pain that turned out, after imaging, to be appendicitis and required escalation to surgery. The child cried before the sutures and not during them, which was the usual order of things. The elderly man's pressure came down once he was reassured that someone was paying attention. The young woman asked Claire 3 times if it was serious and received 3 honest, calibrated answers that gave her the information she needed without performing the situation as more frightening than it already was. None of these patients knew about the night. None of them knew about the bruise on her face, or they knew in the way that people in emergency departments register things they're too preoccupied with their own situations to ask about. They knew a nurse was taking care of them. That was what they knew and what they needed. At 9:45 a.m., Janet Briggs, who had now been on shift for 14 hours and showed no apparent intention of leaving, came to the secondary charting station where Claire was finishing the appendicitis documentation and put a coffee on the desk. "Board meeting in 15 minutes, Janet said. "I heard. Calloway's suspension is on the agenda." "I heard that too. Priya from communications came and found me earlier. She wanted to know if you'd be willing to speak to the board." She paused. "I told her that was your decision and she should ask you directly." "She hasn't. She's working up to it." Janet sat in the adjacent chair with her own coffee. She looked, for the first time since midnight, tired. The real kind. The kind that arrives after the emergency adrenaline is fully spent. "Claire, what do you actually want out of today?" Claire considered the question. It was direct enough to deserve a direct answer. "I want what happened documented accurately," she said. "I want the footage in the permanent record. I want Voss to face what he did in a process that isn't managed or minimized." She stopped. "And I want to go home and sleep for approximately 11 hours. "That's achievable," Janet said. "The last one definitely." "And I want my job back," Claire added, "without conditions." Janet looked at her. Something in her expression was both proud and careful, the combination of a person who respects someone and is also a little worried about them. "The board is going to offer you things," she said, "beyond the job." "I know. And Varga's people are going to offer you things." "I know that too." "What are you going to do?" Claire wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. It was the right temperature, not too hot, which meant Janet had been waiting for a moment to bring it, and had timed it correctly, which was very Janet. "I'm going to listen," she said, "and decide." She looked at Janet. "What do you think I should do?" The question surprised Janet. She didn't show it much, but Claire saw it. They had worked together for 2 years, and Claire had not, in that time, asked Janet what she thought she should do about anything. Janet said, after a moment, "I think you've been doing this alone for a long time. I think that might have been the right call once, and I think it might not be anymore." She picked up her coffee. "That's what I think." Claire nodded slowly. "Yeah," she said. "Maybe." The board meeting ran 40 minutes. Claire was not in it. She knew it was happening from the silence that emanated from the administrative wing and from Priya, who appeared at the ER entrance at 10:35, with the expression of someone who has just come from something significant and is still processing the scale of it. Priya was 29 and slightly underdressed for the situation, in a blazer that fit better 3 months ago, and she stood at the edge of the department with the specific energy of someone who has an important message and is uncertain about the reception. "Ms. Rowan," she said, "the board has concluded its emergency session. I've been asked to—" She stopped. Started again. "Could we speak privately?" They went to the family consultation room off the main corridor, which was the only private room available that wasn't occupied or in use, and sat across from each other at the small table with its box of tissues and its neutral wall art, and its particular atmosphere of things being said that are hard to say. "Effective immediately, the precautionary administrative status has been lifted," Priya said. She had a document, which she slid across the table. "Your employment status is fully restored. The board has also voted to formally censure the administrative action taken last night, as an inappropriate response to an employee who had been the victim of an assault, and that censure will be entered into the institutional record. Claire looked at the document without picking it up. Mr. Calloway is on administrative leave pending a full review of his conduct, effective as of this morning's meeting. Priya's voice was carefully professional, which was costing her a little more than it would have yesterday. The board has also authorized me to convey their formal apology. Not a liability apology, She paused. They asked me to say it was genuine. All right, Claire said, there's one more item. Priya opened the folder she'd brought and retrieved a second document, this one on the hospital's formal letterhead with the board chair's signature at the bottom. The board has approved the creation of a new position, Director of Emergency Trauma Education and Protocol Development. It's been funded for a 2-year initial term with full salary and departmental resources. She slid this document across as well. They want you in it. Claire looked at the second document. It was more detailed than the first. An actual job description, a reporting structure, a salary figure that was considerably higher than what appeared on her current badge. Someone had been working on this for more than an hour, which meant it had been in motion before the board meeting concluded, which meant someone had anticipated this outcome and started drafting, which was either impressive planning or someone had known this was going to happen and had prepared for it. She thought about Varga, about the third-floor conference room, about the way certain things had moved through the night with a precision that felt, in retrospect, less like coincidence and more like architecture. I'll read it, she said. I'm not signing today. Priya nodded. She'd expected this, or something like it. Of course. But the censure and the record correction, those go through today, regardless. Already entered. Claire picked up the first document. Read it properly, which took 3 minutes because she read things properly. The language was direct and unambiguous, which she appreciated. When she put it down, she felt something shift slightly, somewhere in the region where she'd been carrying the events of the last several hours. Not releasing entirely, but settling. The difference between a wound being dressed and a wound being healed, which were related processes on different timelines. Thank you, Priya, she said. Priya gathered her folder. She was at the door when she turned back. For what it's worth, she said, I saw the footage, like everyone else. She stopped. I'm sorry it took a camera for some of us to... She stopped again, seeming to think that the sentence didn't have a good ending. I'm just sorry it happened. There was Vera's phrasing again, more or less. I'm sorry it happened. Simple. Unperformed. Claire had now heard it from 2 strangers in the past 6 hours, and it had landed both times with the same uncomplicated weight. It did happen, Claire said, and now it's documented. She looked at Priya evenly. That's what matters. At 11:20 a.m., in a development that surprised several people who had thought they understood the shape of the day, a second arrest was made. The target was not Voss. Voss was already processed, his status already formally established, the first set of charges already in the hands of the district court, and the second set, the federal charges, which were forthrights, moving through the appropriate federal channels with the particular momentum of a case where the evidence arrived pre-assembled. The second arrest was Sergeant Gerald Mack, who was Voss's direct supervisor in the Ashridge PD Narcotics Division and who had been the voice on Voss's radio at 6:47 a.m., telling him to call directly and not go through dispatch. The IG investigation had been pulling Voss's department communications since 5 a.m. What they found in those communications was a thread that predated the previous evening, a pattern of incident reports, internal communications, and case filings connected to the narcotics investigation that Voss had claimed as his reason for being at the hospital. The pattern, once assembled, indicated that Voss had not been at the hospital to question a witness. He had been there to monitor someone who had been identified in a related case as a potential cooperating witness with the DA's office, and to make sure that monitoring occurred before the DA's office became aware that Voss and Mack already knew about this individual. The narcotics case was more complicated than anyone had presented it. Forthright delivered this information to Claire in a 5-minute meeting at 11:45 a.m. That was the most efficiently structured briefing Claire had received from a civilian in recent memory. He wasn't there because of you, Forthright said. You were incidental. I was there for a different reason. He encountered a situation where he felt his authority was being questioned, and he reacted the way he reacts when that happens, which, we're now finding, has happened before. Before this. 3 prior complaints, 2 from civilians, 1 from a staff member at a different facility. All 3 were resolved internally within his department. Forthright said this with the flatness of someone delivering information they find professionally offensive. None reached formal review. Claire sat with that for a moment, the particular weight of it, 3 people, before her, who had encountered this and had not been able to make it stick. They're in the record now, Forthright said. All 3. As of this morning. What made this different? Forthright looked at her steadily. The military jurisdiction removed it from local handling immediately, and the footage was authenticated before anyone could argue about it. A pause. And the prior complaints are being reopened under the federal review, which means the individuals who filed them will be contacted. Good, Claire said. There's one more piece, Forthright said. Voss's attorney contacted our office at 10 a.m. He is requesting a meeting to discuss cooperation in exchange for consideration on the federal charges. Claire said nothing. I'm not asking for your input on that negotiation, Forthright said carefully. I'm telling you because you have a right to know that it's happening. What he cooperates on, if he cooperates, will be related to Mac and the narcotics case, not the assault. The assault charges are not negotiable. That's your decision, Claire said. Yes, Forthright said. It is. She stood. You've been awake for a long time. I'm fine. That wasn't a criticism. It was an observation. She picked up her notepad. We're going to need a follow-up statement from you in the next 48 hours. When you've had sleep and time to read the file fully. Nothing urgent, just complete. She held out her card, which Claire already had, but she took it again. Call me when you're ready. She left. Claire sat in the family consultation room for another 2 minutes, alone, with the box of tissues and the neutral art and the particular quiet of a room that is designed to absorb difficult things. Then she went back to the ER, because that was where she worked. At 12:30 p.m., she finally read the file. She did it in the supply closet on the second floor, in the padded chair that was still there, and was still not as comfortable as it looked, with the door pulled mostly closed and her phone's secure email open on the screen. She had 45 minutes before her next patient was due, and she used the first 5 of them just looking at the document index before she started reading. The file was 47 pages. The operational history section she skimmed, not because it wasn't important, but because she had lived it, and the clinical language of official records did not add to her understanding of her own experience. The commendation section she read more carefully. There were 6, 2 of them at classification levels. She had never expected to see written plainly, and reading them in the clean font of a declassified document felt different from having received them in person in the moments they had been awarded, which had always felt urgent and contextual and not entirely real. The Kandahar section was the last portion of the file. She read it the way she read incident reports, carefully, from the beginning, with the particular attention of someone who knows that the way a thing is written determines how it exists in the record. It was accurate. Not the version she had worried about. Not the version that had kept her, in certain quiet moments over the past 4 years, from fully trusting that the door she'd closed was going to stay closed. The accurate version. The version that said what had happened in that building, in that particular valley, in the 37 minutes that had determined whether 11 people survived or didn't, and who had made which decisions, and what the outcome had been. Her name was there, correctly attributed, without revision. She sat with that for a while. Outside the supply closet, through the door and the corridor and the floor, she could hear the hospital operating, the overhead PA, the distant mechanical sound of equipment, voices at a register too low to decode, the ordinary sound of a place where people came when things went wrong and were met by other people whose job it was to help. She had been doing that job for 2 years in this building, quietly, without the file and without the commendations, and without anyone knowing what was underneath the badge. She thought about what Janet had said. You've been doing this alone for a long time. She thought about Brant on the ICU table, saying her full name before they put him under. She thought about the board's job offer, sitting in her jacket pocket. At 12:58 p.m., her phone buzzed with a text from Okafor. Colonel Varga is asking if you have time to meet before 2. Conference room 3B. She typed back, "Give me 5 minutes." She closed the email. She put the phone in her pocket. She sat for one more moment in the chair that wasn't quite comfortable, in the supply closet on the second floor of a hospital, where she had spent 2 years being exactly what her badge said and nothing more. And she felt not resolution, not yet, but something in that direction. The beginning of the turn. Then she stood up. And her phone buzzed again. Not Okafor this time, not Forthright, not any number she recognized. A Colorado number with an Ashridge prefix. She almost didn't answer it. She answered it. Ms. Rowan. The voice was male, controlled, with the particular smoothness of a person who makes calls like this professionally. My name is Philip Graff. I'm legal counsel for Lieutenant Darren Voss. I'm calling because my client has asked me to reach out to you directly. Not about the legal matter, which is being handled through the appropriate channels, but because he would like to convey personally his, Mr. Graff, Claire said, regret about the incident and to explore whether there might be a private understanding that could, Mr. Graff. He stopped. Direct communication from your client or on your client's behalf to me as the victim in a federal case is something you should have discussed with Forthright's office before making this call. She kept her voice level. I'm going to hang up and call Investigator Forthright, and I'd suggest you do the same before she calls you. She hung up. She stood in the corridor outside the supply closet and called Forthright and relayed the conversation in 30 seconds. Forthright said, "That man called you directly while Voss is under federal arrest." "Yes." A brief silence that had a specific quality. "I'll handle it," Forthright said, and Claire could hear, under the professionalism, something that sounded like genuine satisfaction at having been given a clear thing to do. She hung up and walked towards the elevator, and she was 3 steps away from it when the doors opened and a man she had not seen before stepped out. Late 50s, civilian clothes, carrying himself with the kind of authority that didn't need a uniform to be visible. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and he said her name in the tone of someone who has been briefed. "Ms. Rowan, I'm Deputy Inspector General Harmon. I've been brought in to—" He stopped. He was looking at the bruise on her face, not the way a stranger looks at a bruise, with the involuntary recognition of someone for whom this injury is part of a file he has been reading since 5 a.m. "I wanted to speak with you before the afternoon briefing," he said, "because there are some additional elements to the investigation that the field team has escalated to my level, and you should hear them before they become public." She looked at him. "Additional elements," she said. "Yes." He glanced toward the conference room at the end of the corridor, then back at her. "Perhaps somewhere private." She thought about the third-floor conference room where Varga had spent the night. She thought about Forthright's 4 investigators. She thought about Voss's attorney calling her 20 minutes after a second arrest and offering a private understanding. She thought about a 47-page file that was now, finally, accurate and public, and hers. "Conference room 3B, she said. "Colonel Varga is already there. Whatever you need to tell me, you can tell me in front of her." He considered this for exactly 1 second. "All right," he said. They walked together down the corridor, and as they reached the door to 3B and Harmon reached for the handle, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at it, and something shifted in his expression. Not alarm. Something more precise than alarm. The look of a man who has received a confirmation of something he suspected and is now adjusting the sequence of what he planned to say. He put the phone back in his pocket. He opened the door. Varga was inside, standing at the window with her satellite phone in the particular stillness that Claire had now seen enough times to recognize as her thinking posture. She looked at Harmon and then at Claire, and her expression did a small, controlled thing. "Good," Varga said. "You should both hear this at the same time." She set the satellite phone on the table. "I just got off with the general's office. There's a development in the narcotics case that Voss was working. It's why Mac was arrested this morning, and it's—" She paused. "It's why Voss was in this building last night, and it's not what we initially assessed." Claire sat down. "Tell me," she said. Varga didn't sit down. She stood at the window with the satellite phone on the table between them and laid it out the way she laid everything out. In sequence, without editorializing, letting the facts carry whatever weight they carried. Voss had not been at the hospital to question a witness in a routine narcotics case. That had been the cover story, and it had held up for approximately 6 hours of investigation before Forthright's team pulled the full communication thread and found what was underneath it. The actual witness, a 23-year-old named Tomas Breck, who was in the hospital that night being treated for a separate unrelated injury, had been identified 4 days earlier as someone who had direct knowledge of a distribution network that connected upward from street-level narcotics into procurement channels that ran through 2 city departments and 1 county office. Voss and Mack were not investigating that network. They were protecting it. Breck had been identified not as someone to question, but as someone to assess, to determine how much he knew, how close the DA's office was to him, and whether he needed to be made unavailable before he became useful to a prosecutor. Voss had come to the hospital to look at Thomas Breck, decide if he was a problem, and leave. He had encountered Claire in the ER while navigating toward Breck's Bay. The confrontation had started, as Forthright had assessed, because he was a man who reacted to any check on his authority as a personal threat. The strike had been impulsive, not calculated, but the reason he was there, the reason any of this had happened, was not impulsive at all. It was the product of years of careful corruption that had been quietly operational until the night a military helicopter landed on a hospital roof and brought the kind of attention that narcotics networks cannot survive. Breck is being moved to protective custody, Varga said. DA's office is being briefed now. The federal investigation into the network is already active. It was already active before last night, which is part of why Mack and Voss were nervous. She looked at Claire. What happened to you last night happened because 2 men who were used to managing problems quietly encountered a situation where they couldn't, and Voss defaulted to the only tool he fully trusted. The room was quiet for a moment. Harmon said, "The connection to the military case is indirect. Commander Brandt's transport here was coincidental to Voss's presence. The unit chose this facility for you, not knowing Voss would be here. But the result is that a federal military emergency and a federal narcotics investigation are now running parallel out of the same building, and the overlap is going to require coordination between our offices over the next several weeks." "That's not my problem," Claire said. "No," he said. "It isn't." He paused. "I'm telling you because you have a right to understand the full shape of what you walked into last night. You weren't targeted. You were incidental. And I want to be direct with you about that, because there's a version of this story where you become a figure in a larger narrative, and the thing that actually happened to you, which was an assault, which was wrong, which was documented, gets absorbed into the bigger case and loses its own weight." He looked at her steadily. "That is not going to happen. The assault case is standalone. It moves on its own timeline, under its own charges, regardless of what Voss cooperates on in the narcotics matter." Claire looked at him for a moment, reading the quality of what he was saying. "All right," she said. "Thank you for telling me directly." He nodded. He gathered his materials. He was at the door when he turned back, and his expression had shifted into something that was not quite official and not quite personal, but somewhere in between. "For what it's worth," he said, "I've been doing this work for 22 years. The call that Voss's attorney made to you this morning, direct contact with a federal victim, 11 hours after arrest, framed as a personal outreach. That's desperation. That's a man who has looked at what the IG has assembled and understood that his room to maneuver is approximately 0. He held the door. "I wanted you to hear that because people in your position sometimes don't know how strong the position actually is." He left. Varga waited until his footsteps faded down the corridor, then looked at Claire with the expression of someone who has been waiting to have a different conversation than the one that has been occupying the last 16 hours. "Sit," Varga said. Claire sat. "I owe you an explanation," Varga said. She said it without preamble, which was either characteristic of her or a deliberate choice for this specific conversation. Maybe both. "When Brandt asked me to bring him to your hospital, I had reservations. Not about your capability. Never that. About what it would cost you. You sealed that file for reasons, and I knew that opening it, even under these circumstances, even correctly, was going to pull you back into a context you had deliberately stepped away from. You did it anyway," Claire said. "He needed you specifically. Not a trauma nurse. You." She looked out the window. "And he was right. You know he was right." Claire didn't argue with that. She had been right there in the chest tube placement, right in the pressure assessment, right in every call she had made from the moment the litter came out of the elevator. She knew she was right. She had known it at the time with the quiet, sourceless certainty that good clinical judgment feels like when you've done it long enough that it stops feeling like judgment and starts feeling like vision. "The file," Varga said. "Now that you've read it, how do you feel?"
You already asked me something like that through Brant. Brant asked from his own need. I'm asking from mine. She turned from the window. I was the one who signed the recommendation for the Kandahar commendation. I was also the one who accepted your resignation without pushing back. Both of those things are true, and I have thought about the second one more than you probably know. Claire looked at her hands. I needed to leave, she said. That was real. I know. And I'm not... She stopped. Chose her words. I'm not asking for an apology for letting me go. I asked to go. You did. Varga's voice was level. But you asked in a context where you had just spent 37 minutes keeping 11 people alive in a collapsing building and then spent 3 weeks in a debrief process that treated you like a variable to be managed rather than a person who needed anything. She paused. I accepted your resignation, and I should have asked more questions first. That's what I'm saying. The room held the weight of that. Claire said after a moment, It's documented correctly now. Yes. That's what I needed. Is it enough? She thought about the supply closet chair, about the 47-page file, about the 6 commendations written in the language of official records that felt, somehow, more real than the moments they described because they were permanent in a way that memory is not. It's a start, she said, on. She went back to the ICU at 2:15 p.m. Brant was more alert than the morning, the specific alertness of a man who has eaten something and had enough IV fluid and has decided to engage with the world rather than letting it happen to him. He was still largely flat, but had the head of the bed raised enough to see the room, and he had been arguing with Theus about the telemetry leads, which Theus had described to Claire in the corridor as encouraging, technically, and also exhausting. She came in, and he looked at her, and she sat in the chair, and they were quiet for a moment in the way of people who have covered the important ground and are finding their way back to the ordinary texture of things. Varga told me about the meeting, he said. Harmon. She told you fast. She tells me things fast when she thinks I need to know them. He shifted slightly, with the careful economy of a man managing incision pain by not making unnecessary movements. The network thing, Voss being there for Breck. Yeah. You were just incidental, she said. I know. He was quiet for a moment. There was something in his expression that she recognized as the particular frustration of a person who understands that a thing happened for structural reasons and still cannot fully make peace with those reasons because the thing itself was specific and personal and wrong. It doesn't make it better, he said. No, she agreed, but it makes it clearer. And clear is useful. He looked at her with the assessment of someone who has known her long enough to know when she means what she says. Apparently he concluded she meant it because he moved on. The board's offer, he said. Varga told me about that too. She tells you a lot. We've worked together for 11 years. She tells me things I need to know and things she thinks I should know, and sometimes the categories overlap. He looked at the ceiling, then back at her. Are you going to take it? I'm thinking. What's the hesitation? She considered how to answer that honestly. The last time I had a title and a role and an institutional identity, leaving it cost more than I expected. Not the leaving itself. The reconfiguring. She looked at the window, the thin afternoon light. Being the person on a badge again, that has a weight to it. It does, he said. It always does. He was quiet for a moment. But you're already that person. You were that person all night, with no title and no file and no one in that ER who knew anything except what they could see. And what they saw was... He stopped. For the first time, something in his controlled composure showed a crack. Small, honest, the kind that happens when someone feels something more strongly than they're prepared to. What they saw was you, exactly what you are. That didn't need a badge. She looked at him. Claire. He said her name the way very few people said it, without the professional distance, without the careful neutrality she had gotten accustomed to. Take the job. Not because the hospital needs it, because you're good at what you do and you've been doing it in a context that's too small for you for 2 years and you know it. She was quiet for a long time. You're not wrong, she finally said. I rarely am. He said it with the straightness of someone making a joke about a real thing, and she smiled at that. A small one, but real. Rest, she said, standing. I'll come back tomorrow. You'll actually come back? I said I would. He settled back against the pillow.
Good, he said. And then, before she reached the curtain, she never stopped being one of us, Rowan. That was always true. The file just made it visible. She didn't respond to that. She stepped through the curtain and walked back to the elevator, and she held those words somewhere in her chest where she could examine them later, when she had the space for it. The formal press briefing happened at 4 p.m. in the hospital's main conference room, and Claire was not in it. Forthright led it, with Harmon beside her and a representative from the DA's office, and the hospital's board chair at the far end of the table. The room had 17 journalists in it, and the kind of tension that builds when a story has been moving fast all day, and the people who know the most about it are finally prepared to speak on the record. Forthright was precise and factual in the way that her entire professional manner suggested she would be. She described the assault. She described the charges. She described the subsequent arrest of Sergeant Mack and the federal investigation into the narcotics network, carefully and explicitly delineating the connection to Voss's presence at the hospital from the assault itself, making clear that both would be prosecuted fully and that neither would diminish the other. She described Claire's role in the medical emergency without using her name, at Claire's specific request, communicated through Okafor that morning. The request had been simple. The medical facts were available, the clinical decisions were documentable, and they could speak for themselves without her name attached to a press briefing she hadn't chosen to be part of. Forthright had respected this without argument, which was one more thing Claire filed in the category of things about Forthright she respected. What Forthright did read, with Claire's explicit permission, was a single line from the declassified file. Not the commendations, not the operational history. One sentence from the Kandahar After Action Report, the sentence that described what had happened in those 37 minutes with the specific, undeniable language of official military record. The room was very quiet when she finished reading it. One of the journalists asked, "Is this individual still in the medical field?" "Yes," Forthright said. "Here? At this hospital?" "She works here. That's all I'm going to say about her current situation, because it is her situation and she gets to define it." There were more questions. There always were. Forthright answered the ones she could answer and declined the ones she couldn't with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this many times and does not experience a declined question as a failure. The briefing lasted 40 minutes. Within an hour, the full substance of it was running on every major news platform, and by evening it had traveled the way Forthright's controlled, factual account traveled, which was differently from the way Voss's leaked partial version had traveled that morning. Differently in the sense that it didn't need drama to carry weight, because what it contained was specific and documented and true, and the truth, when it is finally allowed to be plainly stated, moves through the world with a momentum that doesn't require editorial assistance. Darren Voss was arraigned in federal court at 9 a.m. 3 days later. The hearing lasted 40 minutes. He entered a not guilty plea which his attorney had advised and which the federal prosecutor received with the composure of someone who has made this calculation and is comfortable with where it lands. The evidence package that Forthright's office had assembled was, by any reasonable assessment, thorough. The 3 prior complaints were entered. The footage was entered. 11 witness statements were entered. The falsified incident report was entered, with the original metadata showing that it had been edited twice between 1:03 and 2:15 a.m. After the footage had been reviewed by Voss in the administrative wing, and before he had realized the footage was no longer in custody, he could influence. Gerald Mack, who had spent 3 days watching the evidence package grow, entered a cooperation agreement 2 hours before Voss's arraignment. The agreement required his full testimony on the narcotics network, its connection to city and county personnel, and his specific communication with Voss on the night of the incident. He received a reduced charge and a number of years that his attorney described as favorable, and that the DA's office described as proportionate to the value of what he'd provided. Neither Voss nor Mack would work in law enforcement again. That was not a legal conclusion in those first weeks. It was an outcome that would formalize itself through the proceedings over the months that followed, through the administrative review that stripped Voss's certification pending the criminal outcome, through the departmental investigation that produced a 60-page report on a culture of internal management that had absorbed 3 complaints without acting on any of them, and through the eventual conviction in the federal case that was, in the end, not close. Claire did not attend any of the proceedings. She followed them in the way that people follow things that are moving correctly without requiring their intervention, with occasional attention and without anxiety. Her statement had been submitted. The record was accurate. The rest was the machinery doing what the machinery was supposed to do. She signed the directorship offer on a Friday morning, 2 weeks after the night that had started with the sound of a helicopter, and ended with her standing in a conference room, understanding that the door she'd tried to keep closed had been necessary once and was not necessary anymore. The signing was not ceremonial. It was her and Priya and a document at the nursing station, and Janet walking by and seeing and saying only good in the tone of someone whose opinion on the matter had never been in question. Marcus, who was coming off a night shift and had not slept, heard about it from Janet and appeared at the station with the expression of someone who has just been told something that makes a thing he'd suspected finally formal. "You're staying," he said. "I'm staying." He looked at the document and back at her. I was about to say something, and she could see him deciding whether it was too much, and then he said it anyway because he was young enough to still do that. "I want to train under the new program. When it starts, whatever you're going to teach, I want to learn it." She looked at him. He was 27 years old and had stopped freezing under pressure on a night when a lot of people with more experience than him had done worse. And he had said, "I saw it in a supply closet at 3 a.m. with the sincerity of someone for whom not saying it would have been a lie. "Talk to me in a month," she said, "when the program's structured." He nodded. He went home to sleep. She went back to work. On a Tuesday in the third week, Brant was discharged from the ICU to a transitional care unit 2 floors down, which was a significant step in the direction of eventually being somewhere that wasn't a hospital. He was moving more slowly than he liked, and healing at approximately the rate his body had decided to heal, regardless of his preferences. And he had a routine now: morning PT, afternoon rest, evening reading, Claire's visits 3 times a week, because she was in the building, and because she had said she would come back and she kept the commitment she made. On the Tuesday he was discharged from ICU, Okafor appeared in the ER at 11 in the morning with a flat case under one arm and the expression of someone carrying out instructions he has been given and intends to carry out correctly. "The unit asked me to deliver this in person," he said. He set the case on the charge desk. Janet looked at the case. She looked at Claire. She stepped back. The case contained a commendation, not a copy, not a printout. The physical commendation, formal and finalized, bearing the correct date and the correct language and the signature of the commanding officer. And below that, in a second signature line that she had not expected, the counter-signature of a general she recognized. Below the commendation was a citation. It described the Kandahar deployment in the specific formal language that military citations use. And it described the previous night in the same register: the chest tube, the pressure calls, the successful stabilization of a critically wounded active duty commander under chaotic conditions. It did not say, though, she was merely a civilian nurse. It did not qualify her training or her history. It described what she had done in sequence and attributed it to her completely. The final line read, "For sustained excellence in combat medical care and continued commitment to saving lives at personal cost, this commendation is awarded with full recognition of past and present service." She read it twice. Then she closed the case. Okafor was watching her with the careful attention of someone who has been told to observe how the delivery goes. She looked at him. "Tell them thank you," she said. "You could tell them," he said. "There are people who would very much like to hear it from you directly." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about 4 years. She thought about the door and the ceiling and the supply closet chair, and the supply closet chair had not been comfortable. She thought about what Janet had said. "You've been doing this alone for a long time." "Tell them I'll call," she said. "This week." Okafor nodded. He looked briefly like someone who has successfully completed a task he was personally invested in, though he was too professional to say so. He left. Janet materialized at Claire's elbow 30 seconds later. "Can I see it?" she asked. Claire opened the case. Janet looked at the commendation for a long time. She did not say anything immediately, which was unusual enough that Claire looked at her, and found on Janet's face the expression of a woman who has worked in a department that does not credit its people correctly, for longer than she should have, and who is feeling the weight of that alongside something else. The particular relief of seeing a record set right. "You've been here 2 years, Janet said. "Yes. And the whole time, I was just a nurse," Claire said. "That's still what I am." Janet looked at her. "Yes," she said. "And no."
She closed the case and handed it back. Don't put that in a drawer. I won't. I mean it. I know you mean it. Janet went back to the charge desk with the slightly compressed expression of someone managing emotion professionally, which was very Janet, and Claire held the case and stood in the middle of the ER that she had worked in for 2 years as a name on a badge and was now going to work indifferently, with a title, with a program, with the full weight of her record visible and verified and no longer sealed away in a file she hadn't read in 4 years. The department moved around her. A new patient came through the ambulance bay, a paramedic giving her handoff report to the incoming resident. 2 nurses crossed behind her on their way to different bays. The overhead PA announced a status change on the surgical floor. The broken fluorescent light at the far end of the corridor, the one that had been buzzing since before last night's shift, the one that maintenance had been promising to fix, was, she noticed, no longer buzzing. Someone had finally gotten around to it. She set the commendation case on the desk, behind the charting station, where it wasn't in the way. Then she went to receive the new patient. There is something that people who have never been dismissed, underestimated, or flattened by institutional power sometimes fail to understand. The damage is not only in the moment of the strike. The damage is in the years before it, when you learn to make yourself smaller to avoid drawing the hand that will eventually find you anyway. When you seal your file and change your badge and decide that quiet is safer than visible. When you let the things you know, the things you have done, the things you are capable of, live only in contexts where no one with authority can question them. Claire Rowan had done her best work in rooms where no one knew who she was. She had kept a teenager alive in Bay 4, and stabilized a commander on a rooftop, and placed a chest tube in a trauma bay, and navigated a night of institutional pressure and legal complexity and personal assault without losing her footing once. All of it with her file sealed and her history invisible, and nothing to protect her except the knowledge she carried and the judgment she had built across years of paying careful, costly attention. She had survived the night not because the record finally came out. She had survived it before the record came out. The record just made it possible for everyone else to see what had always been true. That is what power taken from the outside cannot take from you. The thing you actually know how to do. The thing you have spent your life learning. The thing that exists independent of whether anyone in authority has acknowledged it or filed it correctly or chosen to make it visible. It exists whether or not the badge says it. It exists in the work. Darren Voss had looked at a nurse in a faded teal scrub set and seen something he could strike. He had been wrong about that in the specific, provable, legally consequential way. But he had also been wrong in the simpler, older way that matters more. He had looked at a person and seen nothing worth accounting for, and that failure of perception was not a mistake he had made about her specifically. It was a mistake built into the way he moved through the world, and it was a mistake that the world had, until that night, mostly allowed him to keep making. The world stopped allowing it. That mattered. Not because systems of accountability are reliable or consistent or swift. They are none of those things, routinely. But because this one time in this building, it worked. And the people who made it work were a charge nurse with a legal pad, and a resident who stopped freezing, and a field investigator who wrote everything down, and a military colonel who moved with precision, and a general who signed a second line on a commendation, and a retired school teacher who said, "I'm sorry it happened," without any performance attached. Sometimes the structure holds. Not always. Not even usually. But sometimes. And when it does, it matters to stay in the building and finish the incident report and be willing to be found. Claire Rowan had spent 4 years making herself small enough to be left alone. She had done it for reasons that were real, and then she had done it past the point where the reasons were real, because that is what damage does. It outlasts its cause and runs on its own momentum until something disrupts the pattern. The helicopter was the disruption. The night was the disruption. The bruise on her face and the footage from 3 cameras and the 47 pages of a file that said clearly and permanently what she had actually done. She was still in the ER, still in the faded teal scrubs, still the person on the badge. But the badge now